Welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our ever-growing community of the curious. Now prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Isn't it strange how the scenery of rolling hills and quiet woods can change after sundown, turning all that natural beauty into a stage for something unsettling? In the heart of Pennsylvania's Laurel Highlands, under the watchful eye of ancient oaks and winding back roads, one woman's late drive home took a turn from the familiar to the inexplicable, revealing that even the most familiar landscape might hold secrets we'd rather not see. This took place in southwestern Pennsylvania near Ohiopyle State Park, specifically along Route 381. I'm mentioning the exact location because if anyone else has seen what I saw, maybe they'll know they're not alone. Let me set the scene a bit more. It was late October, and the last of the autumn color was hanging on the maples and oaks. The roads here twist and turn, edging steep ravines and dense forest. Daylight in these hills is postcard perfect. Tourists come for the scenic overlooks and the waterfalls. But once that sun dips past the ridges, the shadows in these woods seem to draw closer, and every rustle can send a chill up your spine. I had spent the day at a friend's old cabin off a gravel spur near the Youghiogheny River. We were poking around the barn on the property. He kept talking about odd carvings in the wooden rafters, circles and symbols that didn't look like any old brand marks. Anyway, by the time I left, dusk was settling in. I'd been on Route 381 only 5 minutes when I saw something at the edge of my headlights. A figure I first assumed was a deer stepping out onto the road. I slowed down, expecting it to bolt, but it didn't. Instead, it stood there in a way a deer shouldn't stand, almost too tall at the front shoulders, like it was balancing awkwardly. Its eyes glinted, but not with the usual reflective glare you see from deer. It was more of a soft glow, pointed straight at me. All of a sudden it jerked upright, then dropped down and bolted into the trees with terrifying speed and almost no sound. The silence was the scariest part. As if I just witnessed something that knew how to move without disturbing the leaves or branches. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel my pulse in my ears. I tried telling myself it was just a deer behaving strangely, but I couldn't shake the sense that it was all wrong. When I passed a small cluster of houses near Mill Run, I saw a parked truck with its hazard lights flashing. A man stood next to the vehicle, shining a flashlight into the woods. I rolled down my window an inch and asked if everything was okay. He mentioned seeing some strange creature cross the road a few minutes before I arrived. He didn't call it a deer. He said it looked messed up, like it had extra joints or something. That confirmation from a total stranger made my skin crawl. I eventually reached my cousin's place, still shaken. She shrugged it off, saying there are stories around here about not deer, or deer that aren't quite deer at all, like illusions or something more sinister. She mentioned local rangers once warned her not to wander alone after dark, but they never gave a proper reason. Over the next few days, I got curious and started asking questions whenever I stopped in at the Store Road Market in Normalville. One morning, I asked the cashier if anyone reported weird sightings. A woman in line behind me spoke up quietly, saying she'd seen something similar last year near the outskirts of Forbes State Forest. She recalled that the creature twisted its head around in a way that made her stomach drop. She claimed that when she told the park office, they looked at her like she was crazy. She never brought it up again, but she swears she's never driven that route at night since. I also spoke with a caretaker at Fallingwater, the famous Frank Lloyd Wright house in Mill Run, who said a few staff members refused to stay late in the winter months, claiming they've spotted odd shapes moving in the surrounding woods after dark. He mentioned a rumor that some rangers allegedly removed a carcass that looked malformed, but no official report was ever published. That caretaker claimed to have overheard a conversation where a local official told staff to keep quiet so as not to rile up curious visitors or cause a panic. Whether that's a government cover-up or just small-town hush-hush, I don't know. Then there's the story of a teen who went missing briefly in the area about a decade ago. People said he got lost near an abandoned logging road. He eventually turned up after a frantic search, but he was delirious, babbling about eyes in the dark that belonged to something that seemed like a deer, yet wasn't. Local folks chalked it up to dehydration or fear, but part of me wonders if he stumbled onto the same thing I did. There's a heavy atmosphere here that's hard to describe. Under the towering pines and crooked branches, the forest floor is layered with centuries of fallen leaves. It's the kind of place where you can almost feel the weight of the past. Some folks even whisper about old cult activity hidden in these hills, pointing to cryptic symbols carved on stones near old homesteads. I'm not sure how much of that is urban legend, but combined with these sightings, it adds another layer of unease. I don't know if I'm dealing with a flesh and blood creature, a supernatural anomaly, or something else entirely. All I know is that when you're alone on those winding roads, with only your headlights cutting through the darkness, you start to realize how vulnerable you really are. And sometimes, the world outside that beam of light feels more alive than anything you see in front of you. If anyone else out there has seen something like this, I'd love to hear about it. These hills might be beautiful, but I'm convinced there's more lurking among them than standard wildlife. And so, in the hushed hollows of the Laurel Highlands, a traveler catches a fleeting glimpse of something best left in folklore, except it's standing right there on the roadside. A quiet warning, perhaps, that even the most familiar forest trails can hide creatures we're not prepared to meet when night finally comes calling. They say the towering redwoods in Northern California have stood watch for centuries, guarding secrets that most folks would never dare imagine. Yet every so often, a traveler veers off the beaten path, stumbling into a mystery so unsettling, it leaves them questioning just how ordinary these ancient forests really are. I've been going back and forth about sharing what happened to me in the Redwood National Park area this past spring. I can't quite explain it. Even now, it feels like a fever dream. But I keep replaying the events over and over. It's been haunting my nights for too long, so maybe telling the story will help me. I was driving up the Redwood Highway, US 101, heading toward Crescent City, California, in late April of last year. The plan was to spend a few days photographing those massive old-growth trees. Maybe do some kayaking in the Klamath River if time allowed. I wasn't anticipating anything unusual. I'd been there before, and it's always been just that gorgeous, mist-shrouded wilderness. But from the moment I entered the park, something felt off, like the woods were watching me in a way they hadn't before. I pulled into one of the smaller trailhead parking areas around dusk because I thought I could grab some quick photos of the last light hitting the trunks. Almost immediately, I noticed a battered old station wagon parked in the corner. The windows were fogged up, and there was this cold heaviness in the air. No one else was around, so I assumed whoever owned that wagon was off on a trail. I hopped out of my car, camera bag slung over my shoulder. The forest was quiet. No birds, no wind in the canopy, just a sort of damp silence. I remember stepping onto the trail, seeing the ferns brushing against my ankles. After maybe 5 minutes, I noticed this faint smell that reminded me of rotting seaweed, which didn't make sense since I was a good distance from the coast. Then I started hearing these muffled thumps, almost like footsteps but softer. I thought maybe it was just another hiker, so I waited to see if someone emerged. No one did. It was getting dark quickly, and the silence was getting under my skin, so I decided to head back to the car. As I reached the trailhead, I saw a figure standing near that station wagon. Could have been a man, but it was too dim to tell. He, or it, had a hood up or something covering the head and was stooped looking into the open driver's side door. I called out a quick greeting, but got no response. Just a glance in my direction. I couldn't see a face, just shadow. Then, in a strangely stiff movement, the figure shut the door without making a sound and walked off into the woods, leaving the wagon behind. That was enough for me. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove straight to Crescent City, where I was staying. The next day, I went to the visitor center to ask about any strange activity in the park, maybe break the ice by saying I saw a suspicious person. The ranger on duty didn't say much, just that the Redwood forests attract all sorts of travelers and researchers, some with unusual habits. I pressed a bit more, and he mentioned that occasionally park staff encounter sites in the woods where small fires have been lit and odd symbols carved into fallen logs. He advised me to stay on the main trails. That night, things got weirder. I was in Crescent City near the harbor, grabbing a late bite. I struck up a conversation with a local who claimed the government did biological surveys in the Redwoods back in the 1970s. He mumbled something about odd sightings, people going missing, rumors of cult gatherings deep in the forest, possibly connected to old logging roads. He said half of it is probably just small-town myth. But he also mentioned a retired forestry worker who supposedly saw unidentifiable figures in camouflage near Redwood Creek after dark, carrying strange equipment that didn't look like standard Forest Service gear. The next day, I tried to track down that retired forestry worker, but the lead went nowhere. No one at the local diner or gas station seemed to know him, or they pretended not to. I decided to continue with my photography plans, though, focusing on Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park. The giant trees were mesmerizing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from just out of sight. Maybe it was my nerves from the previous night, or maybe it was the absolute hush that seemed to follow me. Late that afternoon, near the Fern Canyon area, I stumbled upon a small clearing that seemed well-traveled, despite being off-trail. The ground had been cleared of ferns, and in the center, there was a circle of rocks that looked almost ceremonial. I saw black, charred remains in the middle, maybe a burnt offering or something. The strangest part was a series of twisted branches lodged upright in the ground around the circle. My first instinct was that it might be some leftover campfire site, but the arrangement was too deliberate. It spooked me enough that I snapped a few photos before hurrying out of there. Later, I tried to tell a park employee at Prairie Creek Visitor Center about what I found. He gave me a concerned look but didn't press for details. He mentioned that if it looked like a possible cult site or something illegal, I could notify the local sheriff's office. He didn't seem surprised, though, almost as if these stories weren't unheard of. That evening, back in Crescent City, I ran into a couple who said they'd also been exploring near Fern Canyon. They looked rattled when I brought up the clearing. The woman said they heard chanting, though she admitted it could have been the wind or water echoes. The man recalled a faint glow that flickered among the trees, as if someone was carrying a lantern, but they never saw a person. They ended up hightailing it out of there, not wanting to find out who or what was lurking in the fog. The next morning was my last day, and I decided to drive out before sunrise to get some dramatic shots of the mist among the redwoods. The roads were nearly empty. Somewhere near the junction with Bald Hills Road, I spotted what looked like an official SUV pulled off on the shoulder. No visible markings, tinted windows. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was a ranger or highway patrol, but there were no license plates. Just as I passed, someone inside turned on a flashlight, briefly illuminating the inside. I caught a glimpse of a figure wearing a dark uniform that didn't look like standard park ranger attire. It gave me that gut feeling that I should just keep moving. I left that day feeling uneasy, like I'd only scratched the surface of something bigger, Maybe some hidden group out in the woods, or a hush-hush government operation overshadowed by the grandeur of the Redwoods. There's a mood in those forests after dark that's impossible to describe unless you've felt it yourself. It's as though the trees are holding on to old secrets, quietly watching you pass by. And sometimes you get the sense you're not meant to be there at all. Anyway, I'm sending this because I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has had a similar experience in Redwood National Park or glimpsed those weird gatherings among the towering trunks. All I know is I'll never see that stretch of forest the same way again. I might have walked straight into something I was never supposed to see. Sometimes, the desert sun bakes secrets right into the cracked earth, leaving behind murmurs and flickers that dance on the horizon. Far from the neon lights of city life, in the vast stillness of Utah's remote West Desert, one traveler found that silence can hold far more than echoes of the wind. I took a trip out to the Utah West Desert to explore around the Dugway Range, not too far from the Dugway Proving Ground. I'm an amateur photographer with a fascination for the stark beauty of salt flats and desert vistas, so I was hoping to catch some dramatic shots at sunset. I'd been on the road for a few hours coming in from Salt Lake City, and the drive was mostly uneventful. A flat stretch of highway with towering mountains in the distance. The temperature outside was scorching, near 100 degrees, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Late in the afternoon, I passed a sign for Fish Springs National Wildlife Refuge, decided to make a quick detour just to see if there were any interesting birds or wildlife. I had no clue, at the time, that it would lead me down a path I still can't fully explain. On my way out of Fish Springs, I noticed a battered sign pointing to an old mining town called Gold Hill. I'd heard vaguely about this place. Something about old tungsten mines, a bit of a ghost town these days. I felt a spark of curiosity. As I drove that lonely dirt road, I kept getting the feeling that someone was watching from just over a ridge or behind the scattered sagebrush. I shrugged it off as paranoia. The sun was starting its descent by then, bathing everything in an orange glow. Things got strange when I pulled off near a dry creek bed to snap some photos of the sun going down over the mountains. The air was so still, I could hear my own breathing. As I set up my tripod, I heard a low hum, like distant machinery. No vehicles were around, so I figured maybe it was just the wind cutting through the canyons. But the hum had this steady, rhythmic pulse to it that I could almost feel in my chest. It faded after a minute or so, leaving the desert silent again. Just as the last rays of the sun disappeared, I glimpsed movement on a nearby hill, a glint of something reflective. I grabbed my binoculars, scanning the hillside. There was a dark shape that looked like a large vehicle, maybe an SUV, perched way up there, almost hidden among the rocks. No headlights, no sign of a campsite. I couldn't make out any details, but it felt unsettling, like I was being watched. I decided it was time to head back. I drove toward Dugway Proving Ground on a route I'd researched was public, but the signage can be confusing. Lots of warnings about authorized personnel only, testing ranges, that sort of thing. Eventually, I saw another sign telling me to turn around if I didn't have clearance. I was about to do just that when a black SUV with tinted windows pulled onto the road from a side path. It slowed down as it passed me, and I glimpsed a man in the driver's seat wearing what looked like a plain black baseball cap. No identifiable insignia. I waved, but he didn't acknowledge me. Something about that encounter left me jittery. I decided to make my way back to the main highway and find a place to camp overnight. The closest semblance of civilization was a motel in Wendover. I arrived late, got a cheap room, and tried to sleep. I couldn't. I kept hearing that hum in my head. The next morning, over a hasty breakfast at a local diner, I mentioned the weird hum and the SUV to the waitress. She gave me an odd look and said, "Folks around there see unmarked vehicles more often than you'd think." Then she quietly mentioned that she once had a relative who worked on the perimeter security of Dugway Proving Ground, a restricted site involving who knows what, where weird lights were sometimes spotted in the sky at night. She said if I was smart, I'd stick to the main roads and not linger near the boundaries. Later that day, I returned to the desert, hoping to photograph some geological features. When I parked near a rocky outcrop, I noticed something stuck in the dry, cracked ground, a tiny piece of metal with holes in it, almost like a vented cap. I picked it up, thinking maybe it was debris from old testing or mining equipment. It looked too modern to be from the old Gold Hill days. I pocketed it, but the second I did, I got that prickly sensation on the back of my neck again. I set up to take photos of the swirling dust devils in the distance. While adjusting my zoom lens, I spotted a cluster of large black birds circling overhead. Crows, maybe ravens. Then, behind them, way higher in the sky, a gleam of silver flicked in and out of the sunlight. At first, I assumed it was just a plane, but it hovered unnaturally for a few seconds, then shot off at an impossible angle, vanishing almost instantly. I stood there, mouth agape, camera still clutched in my hands. I know the desert can mess with your sense of distance and perspective, but I've seen plenty of planes, and that was no typical aircraft. When I got back to my car, my phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual out there, but the screen was acting strangely, lines flickering, battery percentage fluctuating. For a moment, I thought my phone was dying from the heat, but it felt more like interference. I drove around for another hour looking for a better vantage point, eventually pulling over near an area known as Skull Valley. Lovely name, right? That's when I spotted fresh tire tracks in the dirt that matched a large SUV heading off-road into a restricted zone. No signage indicated a public trail, so it had to be someone who knew the area or had clearance. By this point, I'd had enough. My curiosity was overshadowed by a growing sense of unease, like I'd stumbled onto something that wasn't meant for me to see. I made it back to Wendover late that night. The next morning, while gassing up, I overheard two men in line talking about strange booms heard out near Dugway. One mentioned a rumor that a local rancher saw lights dancing over his fields, followed by a black helicopter that scared his livestock. On my final day, I returned home to Salt Lake City, and that should have been the end of it. But about a week later, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered out of habit. A voice asked if I'd been in the restricted area recently, then hung up before I could respond. It could have been a prank, but it left my heart racing. Even now, I keep thinking about that hum, that unmarked SUV, and the shimmering craft in the sky. I know places like Dugway Proving Ground are rumored to be another Area 51, with all sorts of hush-hush military testing. But there's a difference between reading about these rumors and actually experiencing something that makes you question just how far the rabbit hole goes. I haven't even shown anyone the weird metal piece I found. It's sitting in a drawer in my office, and occasionally I think about sending it for analysis. But then I get a chill, like I might be poking a hornet's nest. Maybe there's a perfectly logical explanation for everything. But after that trip, I can't shake the feeling that something bigger is going on in those desert expanses. Something the average person isn't supposed to witness. Well now, gather around, because sometimes it's not the loudest voice that holds the biggest secret, and when a seemingly ordinary man decides he's seen something far outside the realm of what he's been told is possible, well, that's the moment the story finds its wings. Back in 2015, I was working as a civilian contractor for a construction and maintenance project out at Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California. It was an ongoing contract that often brought me onto the base well after normal hours. There were times we had to do repairs late in the night on the outlying roads that serviced the runway areas. Typically, it was pretty quiet. I'd see the occasional coyote or jackrabbit skitter across the darkness. But beyond that, the night shift was mostly me, my crew, and the distant hum of aircraft engines echoing through the desert air. On one particular night, and this was early August, I remember because the temperatures were still hovering near 90 degrees even after sundown, and we were scheduled to do some quick patchwork on a side road that leads toward a restricted hangar. Normally, we'd have a security escort with us because of how close we were to restricted areas. That night, they were running late, so we just parked up and started doing our job. After about half an hour, I noticed a sudden hush in the air, like all desert life had paused. I know that might sound dramatic, but one moment there were desert crickets and the muffled hum of a generator, and then it was still. The kind of stillness that puts your hair on end. I went to check the equipment around the corner of our service truck, expecting maybe a fuse had blown in the portable lighting rig, but everything was normal. While I was standing there, I heard this shuffle on the asphalt behind me, like a slow but deliberate scraping of boot soles or possibly claws, something that didn't quite match the usual clicking of desert wildlife. When I turned around, I caught a glimpse of a figure stepping into the shadows, almost like it dissolved into the darkness near the fence line. The fence itself was topped with barbed wire, so no normal person would hop it that smoothly. Yet, whatever it was, I didn't see it climb or jump. It was there 1 second, dark, lean, easily over 6 feet tall, and gone the next. I should have said something to my crew right then, but I just stood there trying to rationalize it. An airman out on patrol? A security officer? But the shape. It didn't look right, like the head was too narrow or pointed, and the limbs seemed oddly elongated. Eventually, the rest of the crew came back from the truck with some tools, and I kept my mouth shut. I convinced myself I was seeing things, lack of sleep or too many hours on the job. The real jolt came a couple of weeks later. I was in the base cafeteria, though they prefer us civilians not to call it that, and overheard 2 airmen talking about some unofficial sightings near Hangar 1917, which was built, if memory serves, around the time NASA was conducting experimental craft tests out there. They never said the word reptilian, but they were mentioning something about a creature. I could hear them referencing how it's been spotted near high-security storage more than once. They laughed about it in a nervous way, but you could tell they were rattled, especially because they kept checking over their shoulders. I pretended not to hear. It's a small base, rumor-wise, and the last thing I wanted was to draw attention to myself. Over the next year, my contract work brought me back to that area multiple times. Nothing quite matched the chilling presence of that August night, but I'd hear the occasional rumor from other contractors. Folks whispered about seeing scaled footprints in the sandy areas near the barbed wire fences. One guy even said he found scratch marks on a power box that were way too precise, almost like carved symbols, though to be fair, I never saw those myself. Another person claimed some nights they heard an unearthly hiss near the same corridor we patched, but they never stuck around long enough to find out more. People tend to keep their heads down on these bases. Nobody wants to lose a contract or get blacklisted for telling stories. Then came the strange out-of-the-blue conversation with a sergeant from security forces. He asked me about unusual activity in the southwestern corner of the base, which was way beyond where we usually worked. He didn't give any real reason, just said something like, "If you see anything, keep it to yourself," and handed me his card in a way that felt more menacing than friendly. It was the kind of moment that's easy to brush off as standard security protocol, but I'd been around enough bases to know this wasn't normal. They don't usually come sniffing around to civilians about weird sightings unless something's up. I tried doing some quiet research, not the typical online search because we all know there's plenty of nonsense out there. So I reached out to a friend of a friend who works in the aerospace industry in Palmdale. He casually mentioned hearing from a whistleblower, someone who once worked on a classified project at Edwards, that certain restricted hangars are rumored to store more than just stealth drones. He didn't go into detail, but he hinted at biospecimens that are kept under lock and key. I pressed him, and he clammed up immediately, saying I'd do best to forget he said anything. I'm not a big conspiracy buff, but I have a healthy respect for the fact that the government doesn't always share what it knows. You know, before this happened, I used to tease my cousin for wearing a tinfoil hat metaphorically. He's always rambling about reptilian infiltration in the highest levels of power, pointing out that a lot of leadership figures blink sideways on TV. But something about that August night and all the subsequent hush-hush rumors made me take a second look at those theories. There's an entire community out there convinced that reptilian humanoids have infiltrated government and military positions, using technology or shape-shifting abilities to cloak themselves as humans. I'm not saying I believe all of it, but I've seen enough oddities in my time to know we're not getting the full story from official channels. Sometimes I think about the time I saw a strange marking on the side of a supply crate on base. It looked like an emblem, not the standard Air Force insignia, more like an elongated diamond shape that had scaly edges drawn around it. I joked with one of my colleagues that it looked like a snake's eye, and he just stared at me like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. It's those little moments that really get under your skin, the kind that can't easily be explained away. Was that an old experimental programs patch, or something more sinister? The goosebumps I felt standing there told me it might be the latter. As my contract wound down, I found myself more and more relieved to be leaving that base. Don't get me wrong, Edwards AFB is a marvel. There's decades of aviation history there. But I'm convinced there's also a hidden chapter you'll never see in any museum, something that resonates with the darker corners of the mind. I didn't want to ask too many questions, and I definitely don't want to risk black helicopters showing up at my door, if you get my drift. But the quiet that fell that night, and those strange sightings that so many of us whispered about, were enough to make me certain that normal laws of nature might not hold the same out in the high desert. Since I left that project, I've talked with one or two other guys who stayed on base longer. They told me the weirdness never really stopped. One claimed to see strange lights moving close to the ground behind the runways late at night, lights that weren't from any aircraft we know of, and definitely not from ground vehicles. Another insisted he saw a tall, thin silhouette lurking near the chain-link fences at dawn, looking almost lizard-like in the first rays of desert sun. They asked me if I remembered that night in August. I said, how could I forget? Anyway, that's the gist of it. I'm hoping you'll post this on your YouTube channel, or share it with folks who have seen similar things. I'm not trying to sway anyone's opinion or create a panic. I just believe there's a bigger picture here, something that might connect the dots about bizarre sightings and rumored government cover-ups. If anyone else out there has seen something like this, maybe it'll help them feel less isolated in their confusion. Like I said, I'm no big conspiracy nut. I just know what I saw and what I heard. There's more out there in the desert than just tumbleweeds and test planes. That much I can say with confidence. If you deem this worth sharing, do it. Maybe collectively we can piece together the truth. Sometimes you expect the mysteries of history to stay locked away in dusty archives, maybe a footnote in someone's old journal. But every now and then, a curious soul stumbles upon something that suggests the past is hardly finished with us. Perhaps it's in a hidden alcove, deep in the canyons, where the echoes of the ancients still whisper, daring us to listen. There's something going on at the Grand Canyon, things that stretch beyond the usual geological marvels and scenic overlooks that tourists flock to see. I was working a seasonal position at the Desert View area on the South Rim this past October, just a short gig to help with trail maintenance and basic guiding tasks. Normally, the biggest deal is cleaning up after careless hikers or pointing them toward the restrooms. But on one morning in mid-October, as I was clearing debris near an old less-traveled footpath off Desert View Drive, I noticed a small opening in the rock face I'd never seen before. I've been around the canyon enough to know the main caves and crevices that park officials track. This one struck me as odd, maybe revealed by recent erosion or a rock slide. I suppose curiosity got the best of me, because I ended up deciding to duck inside. It wasn't a big opening, maybe enough to crawl through if you were determined. About 10 feet in, it widened out just a bit, enough to let me stand hunched over. My flashlight bounced off walls that looked almost carved in places, like there'd been some human hand shaping the stone. I saw faint scratch marks, or maybe they were petroglyphs that got worn down. Hard to say. The air in there felt stale, like it hadn't circulated in a long time, carrying a heavy, almost metallic smell. I noticed what at first I thought was a large rock jutting out near the corner of a small alcove, but as I got closer, I realized it was part of a skull, a massive skull. The size was far beyond any normal human remains I've ever come across, and certainly bigger than your average dinosaur or something. Not that I'm an expert on fossils, but this was definitely shaped like a humanoid skull, elongated and weirdly proportioned. I tried to brush away some of the dust, but my hands were shaking. My flashlight revealed what looked like carved symbols in the bone itself. At least, it looked like bone. The texture was unbelievably ancient, and I felt a rush of adrenaline like I had just crossed some forbidden line. I remember stumbling back out into the sunshine, blinking like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't tell any of my coworkers at first, partly because it sounded insane, partly because something in my gut warned me not to talk about it. But I couldn't shake the image of that enormous skull. A few days later, I worked up the nerve to show a friend, someone I'd trust with my life, a fellow seasonal worker. We hiked out together early before the main wave of tourists. It took us a bit to relocate that exact spot, but eventually we found it. This time, the cave entrance was blocked by a makeshift wooden cover, like crude planks hammered together and wedged into the opening. My friend looked at me like I was playing a prank. I remember feeling furious and confused. There was definitely no wooden barrier the first time, and it looked new, like someone did it quickly in the last few days. We both started hearing this low, murmuring sound, not from inside the cave, but from somewhere up above, higher on the rocky slope, almost like chanting, except it was too far off to make out words. My friend wanted to get out of there, kept insisting we leave it alone. We retreated to the ranger station area, and we didn't mention it to anyone else, except he told me he'd heard local rumors about a hidden sect that worshipped ancient giants or reptilian beings in the canyon. I thought he was joking at first, but he swore he'd overheard older rangers talk about it after a few too many beers. Allegedly, there have been sightings of robed figures sneaking around lesser-used trails, sometimes wearing reptilian masks. Sounds ridiculous, right? But at that point, I was ready to believe just about anything. Within days, I noticed a change in how some of the staff looked at me, like they knew something was up. One morning, a higher-up from the National Park Service asked me if I'd been off-trail recently. The conversation was indirect, but his tone was grave. He didn't specifically mention the cave or the skull, but it was almost like he was probing to see if I'd reveal something. Then he casually mentioned that certain areas of the canyon are restricted for public safety, and he gave me a thin smile that made my skin crawl. I don't spook easily, but I left that encounter feeling like I tried doing a bit of my own research. Some folks say the Smithsonian has long been accused of hiding evidence of giant skeletons found in the Grand Canyon. There are old newspaper clippings from the early 1900s referencing alleged Egyptian or Tibetan artifacts discovered in caves out here, though mainstream historians dismiss it all as hoaxes. But reading those old accounts, you get the sense there might be more to it. If the rumors are to be believed, these giant skulls, or mummified remains, are part of a long-suppressed story. And if it's suppressed, that means powerful people are involved. Later that week, I woke up to find a note slipped under my door at the staff dorms. Just a small scrap of paper that said, "Keep away from things that aren't yours." I asked around if anyone had seen someone near my room. No one had, or if they did, they pretended ignorance. That night, I took a long walk along the rim to clear my head, thinking maybe I was overreacting. That's when I glimpsed two figures in dark robes. I thought it was a joke at first, like a couple of tourists dressed for some bizarre costume photo op. They were standing near the edge, not speaking, but almost swaying in unison. I stayed hidden behind a juniper bush. There was a faint glow, like they each held something luminescent. After a moment, they turned and walked off into the shadows, almost gliding. I can't say it was real, but I know what I saw. My pulse didn't settle for hours. Things escalated when I was assigned to an area away from desert view, almost like I'd been deliberately shifted. I asked management why I was being moved when my scheduled work was supposed to remain there through October. They gave a vague excuse about staffing needs, but it felt more like they were separating me from my friend, from the site, and from any further poking around. On my final day, as I was packing my stuff, I found a typed unsigned letter in my car telling me not to speak of what I'd seen. The letter specifically mentioned the relic and the worshippers, and concluded with a warning that certain knowledge is not meant to be uncovered. That's when I decided to leave a few days earlier than planned. I didn't even say proper goodbyes. I was that rattled. Since then, I've scoured online forums and stumbled on stories from a handful of people who claim they came across similar giant bones or suspicious robed gatherings in the canyon over the last century. Many accounts mention intimidation tactics, missing evidence, and talk of reptilian deities or a cult that venerates ancient reptile-human hybrids. It's the kind of stuff that would usually make me roll my eyes. But now, every time I close mine, I see that massive skull, the symbol-like carvings on it, and I can almost smell that stale metallic air again. I'm not claiming to know the truth or the full story. I can only report what I experienced. And if someone else out there has found something similar, maybe they'll see this and realize they're not alone. I'm keeping my name out of this for obvious reasons. I just want people to know there's something in the Grand Canyon beyond the tourist trails, something that someone doesn't want us to see. I don't know if the Park Service is actively covering it up or if there's a deeper network pulling the strings. All I know is that the canyon holds more secrets than we might ever understand, and that some secrets may well be guarded by forces older than we realize. Maybe it's a government thing, or maybe it's a cult thing, or a mix of both. Well, now, have you ever heard a story so strange it makes your skin crawl? A quiet forest, an everyday drive, and one of those encounters that twists the ordinary into something rather unimaginable. Sometimes, the strangest things happen in the most unassuming places, and they leave us wondering if what we saw was ever real in the first place. I'm almost unsure where to start because every time I think back on what happened, my mind starts spinning in 100 different directions. I wasn't even going to say anything. Part of me thinks I should chalk it up to an overactive imagination or a trick of the light. You might be one of the few who'll believe me or at least consider that I'm not losing my grip. The incident took place around late September 2022, out near the southeastern edge of the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I've lived in Warren, PA for a good portion of my life, and I used to fish the creeks around the forest with my dad when I was a teenager. This wasn't my first or even 100th time in these woods. I know the area well enough. Or I thought I did anyway. That day, I was driving up Route 59, heading east toward the Kinzua Dam. If you've never been there, the dam is an impressive piece of engineering that tames part of the Allegheny River. The leaves were just starting to turn. There were flashes of orange and red, though a lot of greenery still hung on. I remember feeling relieved that the tourist season was winding down, so the roads were quieter. Less foot traffic, fewer out-of-state plates rubbernecking the views. Just a peaceful day to clear my head. I pulled over near a small offshoot gravel road I've used before because it leads to a vantage point not many people know about, unless you're a local or an avid hiker. As I got out of the car, I noticed a weird tension in the air, like the birds were too quiet and the usual scurrying of chipmunks or squirrels was oddly absent. I brushed it off initially, thinking maybe a hawk or some predator was nearby. That's typical nature stuff. But the feeling didn't pass. It felt heavier, like the calm before a sudden downpour, except the sky was clear. The only sound was my own crunching footsteps over gravel and twigs. I started walking deeper in, maybe a half mile or so from the road, hoping to get to this rocky outcrop that overlooks the reservoir. This is when things took a turn. I noticed a patch of flattened grass by a thicket of saplings, almost like something large had been lying there or pacing. At first, I thought maybe a deer bedded down. But the impression in the grass was strangely elongated and narrower than what I'd expect from a deer or even a black bear. I bent down to get a closer look, but there were no distinct footprints, more like smoothed-over areas. If you've spent any time hunting or hiking, you know when ground is disturbed in a way that doesn't match the usual game patterns. It stands out. I felt uneasy, but kept going. About 15 minutes later, I was nearing the outcrop when I heard what sounded like a hiss, except deeper, almost guttural. My first instinct was to think maybe a fox or bobcat, but I know the calls of local wildlife well enough, and this was different, more resonant, like it had a chesty quality. I can't explain it better than that. My heart was racing, and I was tempted to just head back to my car. But curiosity got the better of me. I slowly crept through the underbrush until I could see part of the outcrop. And that's when I saw it. Something crouched low to the ground, partially hidden behind a scraggly hemlock. It was pale, almost a grayish-white, lanky, with limbs that looked too long for its body. I remember the arms in particular. They seemed to bend at odd angles, like double-jointed in a way that human arms can't. I didn't get a clear view of the face, but the shape of its head looked slightly elongated. Not quite right for any animal I know around here. No fur that I could see, more like a smooth, almost translucent skin, especially near its shoulders where the light hit. Honestly, I was so startled I made a noise, sort of an involuntary gasp. In that instant, the thing whipped its head around in my direction, and I caught a glint of dark, reflective eyes. I froze. There was this electric charge in the air, like the moment jolted us both into sharp focus. It moved in a blur, scuttling backward and away over the rock face, with an unnatural speed. The last glimpse I had was it disappearing into the tree line below the outcrop, almost on all fours but not quite, with those long limbs contorting as it vanished. I stood there for maybe a minute, trying to process. Part of me wanted to chase after it. Another part of me was yelling in my head to get the hell out. Eventually, my nerves took over, and I turned around, nearly tripping over a root in my haste. As I headed back toward the gravel road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from behind the trees. Every so often, I'd glance back, half expecting that pale, twisted form to be following. I got back to my car and just sat there for a while, engine off, locked doors, trying to steady my breathing. One bizarre detail I recall is how utterly silent it still was. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves, like nature itself was holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity, I started the car and drove back home. I kept telling myself to forget it, that maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe I saw an injured deer or something. But that wouldn't explain the hiss, or the shape, or those limbs. The strangest part, a couple of nights later, I had an odd dream. I usually don't put much stock in dreams. It was so vivid, though, like I was back in the forest, but it was dusk. In the dream, I could see that same pale figure lurking in the distance, beckoning me forward. Then everything went white, like a flash of lightning. I woke up drenched in sweat, convinced there was something in my room. There was no one there, obviously. But I couldn't sleep after that. A week went by, and I found myself checking local message boards or any small-town chatter to see if anyone else had seen something similar. People talked about Bigfoot sightings in the Allegheny area now and then, mostly near Bradford or along the North Country Trail, but I've never heard of anything matching this. Eventually, I confided in an old friend of mine who used to do volunteer ranger work. He just stared at me, pale-faced, and said he once came across a weird pale figure at the edge of the Allegheny Reservoir just after sunset. He never reported it for fear of being laughed at. That weird sense of relief and dread hit me at the same time. Relief I wasn't entirely alone. Dread that this thing might not be a one-time anomaly. I toyed with the idea of contacting some sort of wildlife official. But who do you call to say you saw a pale, elongated creature scuttling around on all fours? I ended up telling no one but that friend. I did, however, do a bit of reading on crawler humanoid sightings, the Glimmer Man sightings, and other rumored cryptids. The descriptions and eyewitness sketches that some folks post online are uncannily close to what I witnessed. I'm not a big believer in the paranormal, or at least I wasn't. But seeing something like that up close changes the way you look at the world. Part of me wonders if there's some old folklore or ancient legend in these forests that people have forgotten. The Allegheny region has a deep history. Native American tribes once lived all through these hills, and there are stories about spirits or shapeshifters that guard the land. I'm not sure if that ties in, or if this is something else entirely, maybe even interdimensional. I realize that sounds crazy, but if you'd been there, you'd know there was something off, something bigger than a simple animal sighting. I don't have any physical proof, no pictures or footprints, just a memory that still feels too vivid to ignore. Whether it was a crawler humanoid, some undiscovered species, or a figment of my imagination, I can't say for certain. All I know is that it shook me to my core, and the forest hasn't felt the same since. I wanted to share it with you because your channel seems to draw out people who've had similarly bizarre experiences. Maybe together we can start to piece together the truth. If not, then at least I've gotten this off my chest. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and feel free to share it if you think it might help others. So, there you have it. An ordinary man on an ordinary day, catching a glimpse of something that might be anything but ordinary. One can only wonder how many other stories lie hidden among those sprawling Pennsylvania forests, kept secret by the silence of the trees and the mysteries they guard. They call it the Pine Barrens, an endless sprawl of twisted pines and sandy trails, haunted by centuries of hushed whispers. It's a place where local folklore can feel like more than just stories, where the very air seems weighed down by secrets. Sometimes, late at night, you might hear a distant cry echoing through the trees, and wonder if there's something out there that defies explanation or reason. This all happened in the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey. I was staying at a friend's cabin near Batstow Village in Wharton State Forest, the same region infamous for its ghost towns, weird local tales, and, of course, stories of the Jersey Devil. I've heard the usual lore, everything from the Leeds family curse to strange cult circles out in the middle of nowhere. I always chalked it up to wild folklore. But the night I arrived, something felt off. The cabin itself wasn't too far from the Molokai River, tucked beneath a canopy of pine and oak. It was humid, the kind of night where the air clings to your skin. Around 9 p.m., we were wrapping up dinner when we noticed an awful stench wafting in through the screen door. Like rotting meat, heavy and metallic. My friend said maybe a deer died nearby, but I've smelled carrion before, and this was worse. Almost chemically pungent, like decay mixed with burnt rubber. Before bed, I stepped out to the porch, half hoping the fresh air might clear that foul smell. That's when I noticed something in the dirt, just at the edge of the trees. It looked like a dead rabbit, but I can't even call it a rabbit anymore. It was so mutilated. Its hind legs were missing, torn off in a way that didn't look like a coyote or fox kill, too jagged, almost like the limbs were ripped rather than bitten. The body looked scorched around the edges, as if something hot had seared it. Needless to say, I left it where it lay. I didn't sleep much, replaying that gruesome image in my head. Early the next morning, I went back out to bury the thing or at least move it, but it was gone. No tracks, no sign of disturbance, just a dark stain in the dirt and a few bits of fur. I decided to drive into Hamilton for supplies, and at a small market, I overheard two older locals chatting about strange kills, turning up along the bogs near Atchin Lake. One claimed he found a deer carcass half embedded in the mud, its rib cage splintered open. The other just shook his head and mumbled something about staying away from the back trails after sunset. I quietly asked if they knew what might be responsible, and they shrugged, saying maybe some sick predator or that old devil story come to life. Later that day, my friend introduced me to an elderly caretaker who manages a cluster of abandoned cranberry bogs deeper in the forest. We visited him because he sometimes sells fresh berries on the side. When I asked if he'd heard anything unusual, he said he'd been hearing screeching noises late at night, like the cry of a wounded animal, but more guttural. He also claimed to have seen lights moving between the pines after midnight, as if someone was carrying lanterns. He used the phrase, "the watchers," but didn't elaborate, just got quiet and gazed off into the distance. That night, I convinced my friend to drive out with me to one of the old bogs. The road was more sand than gravel, lined with tall, scraggly pines that pressed in from both sides. After a few miles, we cut the headlights and just listened. It was eerily quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing but our own breathing. Then faintly, this low groan drifted through the trees. It intensified, morphing into a ragged scream that shot chills up my spine. My friend whispered that we should leave. Right then, something thumped loudly on the roof of the car, like a heavy branch had fallen from above. We both jumped. I scrambled to flick the headlights back on, and in that split second, I saw a shape leap off the roof into the darkness. It moved too fast to identify, but it seemed large, bigger than a dog, but hunched with what looked like elongated limbs. My friend slammed on the gas, and we tore out of there, my heart pounding. The next morning, we found fresh scratches along the car's roof, 4 parallel lines, shallow but precise, like claws had raked it. My friend tried to rationalize it as a branch, but the grooves were too straight, too deliberate. We decided to head into Batstow Village to see if we could talk to a park ranger or someone with local knowledge. The ranger was polite but unhelpful, insisting that no large predators inhabit the area other than occasional coyotes. When we mentioned the deer carcasses and the horrific condition they'd been in, the ranger just nodded and said people sometimes exaggerate. A little later, we met a woman at the visitor center. She was flipping through postcards, wearing a t-shirt with the old Leeds family motif, the folks rumored to be connected to the Jersey Devil origin. She said she'd grown up in Chatsworth and had plenty of nights hearing unearthly shrieks from the pine stands. She once saw a deer run out of the woods, missing patches of fur, as if it had been burned or corroded by something. She said the creature seemed delirious, eyes bulging with fear, and it collapsed shortly after. Locals found it the next day, riddled with deep wounds and scorch marks, as if acid had been poured on its flesh. She believed a dark entity or some experimental creature roams the barrens, not the classic winged devil, but something equally sinister. I started poking around the deeper corners of local lore. There are whispered rumors of clandestine labs in the barrens. Some say government-affiliated, others say private groups, testing on wildlife. Another story I heard was that these robed cults hold rituals to summon the original spirit of the Pine Barrens. One man I spoke with, while fueling up near Chemung, claimed he once stumbled on a clearing scattered with half-burned bones, arranged in strange patterns. He said a black SUV pulled up soon after, and two men told him to leave if he valued his safety. He's convinced there's a cover-up afoot, though he can't prove any of it. On my final evening, I was alone at the cabin. My friend had left for a family emergency. I was trying to relax with a book, but around midnight, the power cut out. Total darkness enveloped the place. My phone's flashlight revealed shadows dancing on the walls as the wind rattled the windows. Then I heard slow, heavy footsteps on the porch. My heart raced. I'd locked the door, but that did little to calm my nerves. The footsteps paused near the window, and I swear I saw a silhouette with broad shoulders, an elongated head, and something glinting, like eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. I didn't move or breathe. I just waited, paralyzed by the idea of what might be outside. After what felt like an eternity, the steps retreated, fading into the night. I spent the rest of the night curled up in a chair, clutching a kitchen knife, flinching at every rustle or creak. I left the Pine Barrens at dawn, nerves on edge the entire drive back. I couldn't stop replaying the images, the mutilated rabbit, the scorch marks, that unholy scream, and the figure on the porch. This went beyond the typical Jersey Devil sightings I'd heard about. It felt more violent, more malevolent, like something unnatural is prowling those woods. Maybe it's an undiscovered predator, maybe it's some twisted government experiment, or maybe it's something else entirely, a shadow of the old legends that's grown darker over time. I keep hearing fragments of the same horrifying puzzle. Burnt carcasses, bizarre lights, scorched footprints, black SUVs, robed gatherings. Something is stirring in those pine stands, and I'm not convinced it's just one phenomenon. If anyone out there has witnessed similar events, or if you've heard rumors from your own time in the Pine Barrens, I'd love to know. Even if it's just to confirm I'm not alone in experiencing whatever hunts those woods after nightfall. In that vast labyrinth of scrub pines and lonely roads, a traveler found more than just eerie folklore. The Pine Barrens have always held their secrets close, but when the night air turns foul and the screams echo under a moonlit sky, we're forced to wonder, is the legend worse than the reality, or is the reality far more terrifying? They call it the Beast of Bray Road, a stretch of rural highway in southeastern Wisconsin rumored to host something that roams under the moonlight. Some say it's nothing but a legend, a tall tale born around farmland firesides. But every legend has its believers, and then there are those who've come face to face with something they can't quite explain. This happened in July 2022, not far from Elkhorn, Wisconsin, on the infamous Bray Road. I wasn't there on any cryptid hunting expedition, just visiting a friend who owns a small horse farm. I'm the sort of person who scoffs at horror movies, so you can imagine my surprise when the unbelievable started lurking right in front of me. Let me backtrack. I'd vaguely heard of the Beast of Bray Road from some news article, probably references to Linda Godfrey's reports years ago, but I never paid it much mind. The day started normally enough. I arrived around noon, helped my friend with feeding the horses, and we sat on her porch exchanging small-town gossip over lemonade. By late afternoon, she ran out to do errands in Lake Geneva, leaving me alone to enjoy the peace of the countryside. I took a short walk down Bray Road at sunset, just to stretch my legs and enjoy the glow of the fields. As I passed a cluster of tall corn, I noticed something just off the road. Looked like roadkill, maybe a raccoon or small deer. Not unusual out here. The odd part was how it appeared to have been shredded, not just hit by a car. Fur, flesh, and bone strewn around in a way that felt more violent than a typical accident. A wave of nausea hit me, and a sense that I should probably turn back. But the sky was so pretty and the evening so quiet, I convinced myself it was just a coyote or maybe a stray dog that had done the damage. I wandered a bit further before heading back. A neighbor's dog started barking frantically from behind its fence, the kind of bark that's more alarm than greeting. I tried peering through the twilight to see what had it riled up, but there was nothing on the road except me and a few streetlights flickering on. I shrugged it off and made it back to my friend's property without incident. That night, I decided to sleep with the window open. Summer breeze, crickets, the usual countryside lullaby. Sometime around 2 a.m., I jerked awake to a sound I can only describe as a low, guttural growl. It was so deep I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. I thought maybe the horses were spooked, so I jumped up, grabbed a flashlight, and slipped on my boots to check. Outside, everything was silent, as if the entire night froze the second I opened the door. I walked toward the horse paddock, scanning the beam of my flashlight across the grass. The horses were restless, huddled in a corner of the fence, eyes wide. I muttered a few reassuring words, but they stayed pinned to that spot, noses flaring. Then, near the edge of the field, behind an old storage shed, I saw a large silhouette, hunched, with a thick torso and what looked like pointed ears on top of its head. It was too dark to see detail, but the shape was unmistakably bigger than a normal dog. More upright, too, as if it was crouching on two legs. My flashlight caught a brief glint of eyeshine, an amber reflection that flicked toward me. Every hair on my neck stood up. I heard a snarl, low, rumbling, the same growl that woke me. The figure dropped to all fours, or maybe it had already been on all fours, but it moved in such a fluid, unsettling way. Before I could blink, it bolted, disappearing around the side of the shed. My heart pounded so loudly I worried I'd spook the horses even more. I tried following with the flashlight, but there was just darkness and the faint rustle of cornfields. I hurried back inside, locked the doors, and stayed up the rest of the night, jumping at every little noise. The next morning, my friend came back and took one look at me, asked if I'd seen something outside. I told her about the shape, the growl, the eyes. She tensed, said people around here whisper about a werewolf-like creature, a big dog man. I must have looked incredulous because she insisted that a few neighbors had stories of sightings. She said it might just be a large wolf, but wolves aren't common in this area, and she's never seen one near her farm before. That day, we checked around the shed for tracks. The ground was hard, though we did see some shallow impressions, bigger than my palm, but not clearly defined. We also found claw marks on a wooden plank leaning against the side, 4 parallel lines, each about an inch apart, scratched into the grain. She'd never noticed them before. We ended up visiting a small diner in Elkhorn, where a couple of locals overheard us asking about strange animals. One older woman said something about seeing a wolf walking on its hind legs near Bray Road in the 1990s. Another man rolled his eyes, but admitted that late at night, some folks claimed to see a shaggy figure dart across the road and vanish into the cornfields. I asked if maybe it was just a bear, but they insisted black bears are extremely rare in that region, and none are known to walk like that. That evening, around dusk, we decided we weren't going to let fear keep us locked inside. We sat on lawn chairs watching the tree line, trying to pretend we were just stargazing. About half an hour in, we heard snapping twigs off to the right, near a row of overgrown bushes. We shone a flashlight, and for a split second, I thought I saw something tall and broad slip behind a tree. But the next moment, it was gone, and the only movement was a bat fluttering overhead. We packed it in soon after. I left the farm the next morning. As I drove back down Bray Road, I noticed a fresh scrape in the asphalt, like something heavy had dragged claws across it. Could be from a piece of farm equipment, I told myself, but it looked too random, like long claw marks. My phone had no signal most of the drive, so I couldn't even snap a decent photo or check maps. I felt watched until I finally hit the main highway. Since then, I've gone down a rabbit hole of research about dogman sightings. There are more accounts than I ever realized, scattered across the Midwest, but Bray Road is a hub of these stories. Some talk about government hush-hush, as though there's knowledge of a rogue predator out there, but no official confirmation. Others say it's something supernatural, a shapeshifter or cryptid that's been around for generations. I don't know what it is. I just know I'm not the kind to jump at shadows, and that night, I definitely jumped. It's one thing to read about a legend in a newspaper clip, but another to stand there in the dark, hearing horses panic, and realize you're looking at something that shouldn't exist. So, under the moonlit fields of rural Wisconsin, one visitor's quiet weekend unraveled into a brush with something that defied both logic and local explanation. A reminder, perhaps, that when folklore steps off the page and into the shadows of our world, it can leave us forever changed. Out in the ageless expanse of Sedona's red rocks, where legends and government secrets intertwine beneath a burning sky, one traveler's brush with the unknown soon turned into an encounter far more unnerving than any folklore could predict. When shifting lights, spectral figures, and eerie vibrations give way to shadowy interrogations by officials whose methods chill the bone, the line between myth and a government cover-up becomes frighteningly blurred. I experienced something last August in Sedona, Arizona, that has left me questioning the nature of our reality, and, more disturbingly, the secrets the government seems determined to keep hidden. I had set out from Phoenix with high hopes of experiencing the mystical charm of Sedona's red rock formations. I parked on a quiet pull-off along State Route 179 near Bell Rock, where the sky was ablaze with the colors of dusk and the desert air crackled with an inexplicable energy. It wasn't long before I noticed the unusual, a series of erratic, pulsating lights that defied explanation. They shimmered in hues of blue, green, and crimson, merging seamlessly with the fiery sky. I was compelled to document the display, setting up my camera on a tripod and recording the surreal dance of light. As I stood there, transfixed, a figure emerged from the labyrinth of red rock shadows. It was a tall, gaunt silhouette with angular features and eyes that flashed an unnatural, icy blue. In that split second when our eyes met, I felt as though I'd been peering directly into a well of ancient sorrow, and a warning. I raised my camera to capture the moment, but the image dissolved into a haze of static, as if the being was deliberately erasing its presence. The desert around me seemed to shudder. The lights pulsed faster, and a deep, almost imperceptible hum resonated from the earth itself. Before I could process further, the atmosphere shifted. The surreal spectacle was abruptly interrupted by the sound of a vehicle engine approaching in the distance. I barely had time to register my alarm when two unmarked black SUVs pulled up near my truck. I watched in disbelief as two men in dark suits emerged from one of the vehicles. Their faces were stern, their eyes cold and unyielding. I didn't recognize them as local law enforcement. There was something distinctly off about their demeanor, something that hinted at secrets far beyond routine patrols. They approached with measured, almost predatory steps. I recall one of them speaking in a low, clipped tone that carried an unspoken threat. They didn't ask directly about the lights or the figure I'd seen. Instead, they peppered me with questions about my camera, my notes, and my reasons for being at that remote overlook. Their tactics were invasive, pressuring, with a subtle implication that I had witnessed something that was not meant to be shared. Their words were laced with warnings, hints that if I spoke of what I'd seen, I'd be treading on dangerous ground. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Their questions were delivered in such a way that I knew it wasn't just standard procedure. These were government officials, and they were clearly protecting something. They made vague references to national security and sensitive information without ever elaborating. At one point, one of them rested a hand on his holstered sidearm, and I realized with mounting terror that I was being interrogated using tactics that I have no desire to recount in full here. Every fiber of my being screamed to remain silent, and though I tried to answer as little as possible, their probing left me shaken and fearful. They took my camera and downloaded a few seconds of footage from my recording, muttering about data integrity and anomalous activity. I was warned, quietly, with a look that conveyed more than words, that I was not to speak of what I'd witnessed. They even suggested, with an unmistakable undercurrent of menace, that my continued inquiries might unsettle things further. Once they finished, they escorted me back to my truck, where they left as silently as they had arrived, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread and a voice in my head urging me to forget the night's horrors. I drove back to my motel in a daze, every shadow outside my window twisting into sinister shapes. That night, as I lay in bed with the door bolted and the lights on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not just by the spectral figure among the red rocks, but by an unseen force that had now infiltrated even the mundane corridors of government power. The next day, I attempted to piece together any record of their visit, but all official channels remained stone silent. I've since been warned by anonymous sources, friends of friends who work in obscure government circles, that certain events are better left unspoken. The fear of repercussions keeps most of them silent, and I must admit I am terrified to share even this account. Since that fateful night, I've encountered numerous unsettling details that have only deepened the mystery. In hushed conversations with local UFO enthusiasts and retired military personnel, I've heard whispers of government cover-ups involving supernatural phenomena. Some claim that interdimensional entities and cryptid creatures are monitored under strict secrecy. Others insist that the Sedona region is one of several hot zones, where the veil between worlds is dangerously thin, and where those who glimpse the truth are silenced. I continue to live with the constant terror of reprisal, of government officials coming for me if I dare speak too openly about what I witnessed. Every time I close my eyes, I see those piercing blue eyes of that gaunt figure, and I hear that insidious hum mingled with the heavy footsteps of those dark-suited men. I'm writing this with trembling hands, partly as a catharsis, partly in the hope that someone else has encountered these inexplicable events. I've been told time and time again to keep this story to myself, to bury it deep within and let the desert's secrets remain undisturbed. But I can't. Not when the truth continues to haunt me and the inexplicable evidence lurks just beyond the horizon. I only hope that someday the light of transparency might dispel the shadows that now rule over Sedona's sacred red rocks. Beneath Sedona's ancient scarlet cliffs, one traveler's brush with a shifting spectral reality and the cold indifference of government interrogators reminds us that some mysteries are shrouded in layers of secrecy and fear, as the desert night swallows both light and truth. We're left to wonder what cost our curiosity might demand. My dear watchers, your presence is a gift. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, your courage. But remember, there are others who wander, unaware of the dangers that await. By liking this video and subscribing, you offer them a light in the darkness. Support our channel and keep the stories coming, simply by giving a thumbs up and subscribing and sharing.